Hey guys, welcome aboard to Snooze Voyager, the only history channel that tucks you in, blows your mind, and sends you off to dreamland smelling faintly of horse manure and ambition. Tonight, we are setting sail not across any ocean, but across time, to a city so loud, so chaotic, so aggressively alive that it practically needs its own medication. We're talking about New York City in 1907, not the sleek, glass-towered, overpriced coffee New York you might be picturing. No. We're talking about the New York where the subway was brand new and terrifying, where horses and automobiles occupied the same streets, and neither trusted the other, where you could buy a 5-course dinner for 20 cents, or die of typhoid fever by Thursday. Before we get into it, please take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy falling asleep to obscure historical chaos. It means the world. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is, because somehow it is always 2 in the morning for somebody. Now, dim those lights, flick on a fan, pull that blanket up to your chin. Maybe check that your feet are safely under the covers, away from whatever is lurking in the historical gutter water of your imagination. Let's pause for just a moment. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to live in New York 119 years ago? Did people feel modern? Did they think they were living in the future? What did a Tuesday morning smell like when half the city still ran on horses? Could you afford rent? Or were you crammed into a tenement with 47 strangers and one window? Did anyone sleep? Did anyone bathe? Was there a line for the bathroom? And was the bathroom even inside? What did you eat for breakfast when the grocery store as we know it did not exist? How did you get to work, and was work trying to kill you? And what did people do at night in a city that was just beginning to figure out electricity? Congratulations. You've just woken up in 1907 New York. You're on a narrow cot in a Lower East Side tenement building. It smells like boiled cabbage, coal smoke, and someone else's ambition. The city outside is already screaming, and your alarm was not a phone, it was a horse. Let's talk about where you live. And by where you live, we mean a room approximately the size of a modern walk-in closet, except instead of clothes, it contains your entire family, a coal stove, someone's grandmother, and a smell that has developed its own personality. Welcome to the tenement. In 1907, more than 2 million people in New York City are living in these tall, narrow, shoulder-to-shoulder apartment buildings, crammed along the streets of the Lower East Side, the East Village, Hell's Kitchen, and beyond. Yours is a railroad flat, meaning the rooms are lined up one after the other like train cars, with no hallway. So to get from the kitchen to the bedroom, you walk through every other room, past every other person, and past whatever they happen to be doing at that moment. The building itself is 5 stories tall and roughly 25 feet wide. It sits on a lot designed for a different era, a different population density, and a completely different understanding of what constitutes acceptable square footage per human being. There are 4 families on your floor. There are 4 floors above the ground level. That is a great many people sharing one staircase that creaks. On the 3rd step, and has been creaking on the 3rd step since the building opened, and will creak on the 3rd step until the building eventually gives up entirely. Your apartment has 3 rooms. This sounds reasonable, until you understand that one of those rooms has no window. It is an interior room, walled in on all sides by other apartments, other walls, other lives. Reformers in this era call these rooms dark rooms, and write very concerned pamphlets about them. You call it the bedroom. The kitchen is where you cook, eat, wash, work, and receive visitors. It has 1 window that looks out onto an air shaft, a narrow vertical gap between your building and the next one, through which you receive a column of air that has been used by every other apartment in both buildings before arriving at yours. It smells accordingly. The walls of your apartment are thin enough that you are, in a very real sense, a participant in the lives of all your neighbours simultaneously. You know when the Rosenbergs are having an argument. They know when your youngest child has a cough. The Martinellis on the floor above have a dog that technically isn't allowed, but the landlord has decided this is someone else's problem. The building vibrates slightly when the elevated train passes 2 blocks away, which it does every several minutes all day and for a significant portion of the night. The furniture is minimal. A table, some chairs, a bed, possibly 2, with sleeping arrangements that require the kind of geometric creativity usually reserved for professional puzzle designers. a trunk where documents and anything valuable are kept. The coal stove in the kitchen is the warm heart of the apartment, the thing that heats both the room and the water and the food simultaneously, which sounds efficient until summer, when it turns the apartment into something approaching a professionally operated sauna. The rent is $8 to $12 a month, which is not cheap relative to what you earn. The landlord collects it personally, every week, sometimes every 2 weeks, and there is no negotiation, no lease in any language you fully understand, and no recourse if something breaks, because what is going to break has already broken and been like this since before you moved in. And yet, you have hung a curtain in the window. There is a photograph on the wall. Someone has put a small plant on the sill of the kitchen window, leaning it toward the thin stripe of sky visible above the air shaft. It is not much, but it is yours, and in a city this loud that matters more than anyone who has never needed it could possibly understand. It is 5:45 in the morning and you are already behind. The alarm clock, a small, tinny, deeply aggressive device that sounds like a silverware drawer falling down a staircase, has done its job, and now the tenement is stirring. Your first challenge of the day is water. Not hot water, just water. If you are lucky, your building has recently been connected to running water, which means there is a single cold water tap shared by every family on your floor located in the hallway. You take your turn, wait, rinse your face with water cold enough to rearrange your facial features, and consider this a full and complete morning routine. There is no shower. There is no hot water heater. There is a bathtub in some buildings, a tin one, rolled out once a week, and it is filled laboriously, kettle by kettle, from water heated on the stove. In the meantime, the stove itself must be started. This is not a button. This is not a dial. This is coal, which lives in a bucket that you carried up from the basement yesterday evening, and it requires paper, kindling, a match, patience, and a willingness to crouch in front of a small iron door in the dark while the rest of the family waits. On a good morning, the fire catches cleanly, and the kitchen begins to warm within 20 minutes. On a bad morning, you are still crouching at 6:15, developing opinions about coal as a concept. While the stove does its work, you get dressed. Your clothing is practical and worn and clean. Cleanliness is a point of serious personal pride in the tenement culture, the one form of dignity fully within your control. Your work clothes are brushed and hung on a hook. You dress quickly, partly because the apartment is cold until the stove gets going, and partly because the bedroom contains other sleeping people who do not need to be involved in your morning routine. The children must be woken, dressed, and fed before school, public school, which in 1907 New York is genuinely excellent by international standards and is one of the great sincere promises the city makes to its newcomers. Getting children out of bed has not changed meaningfully across the centuries. They do not want to get up. They have opinions about their clothing. Someone cannot find a shoe. This is all happening in a space the size of a generous hallway, while breakfast is being made and the stove is being managed and the grandmother, if applicable, is already awake and has already begun describing a dream in detail. You wash your face with the water from the kettle, warm now, which is a luxury worth acknowledging. You comb your hair over a small mirror hung by the kitchen window. There is no bathroom in the modern sense. There is a chamber pot under the bed for the night. There is the outhouse in the courtyard for the morning, and we will get to that in a moment with the gravity it deserves. By 6:30 you have eaten, the children are aimed at the door, and you are pulling on your coat in a hallway that smells of 6 other people's breakfasts. You do this every day, Monday through Saturday, without exception, without sick days, without the concept of a morning where you simply decide not to. The alarm did not ask how you are feeling. The factory does not either. You step outside into the cold air of a city already in full motion, and you begin. Now, we need to talk about the bathroom, and we need to do this calmly and without judgment, because what you are about to hear will make you feel a profound and previously unfelt gratitude for your indoor plumbing. In 1907, many tenement buildings in New York City still rely on outhouses, small wooden structures in the courtyard shared by the entire building. An entire building. We are talking dozens of families, potentially 100 people, one outdoor toilet facility, all weather access required. In winter, this is a spiritual test. In summer, it is an olfactory experience that will follow you for the rest of your life. The walk to the outhouse requires you to go downstairs, however many flights that means for your particular apartment, cross the courtyard, which in January is a stone-floored wind tunnel, and enter a small wooden structure that has been visited in the last 24 hours by somewhere between 50 and 100 of your neighbours. There is no heat inside. There is no ventilation in any meaningful sense. There is a hook on the door and a basic wooden seat, and the understanding that you will be efficient about this and return the facility to a neutral condition for the next person, because you live in very close proximity to the next person and community relations matter. The City of New York is aware that this is a problem. Progressive reformers have been writing reports about tenement sanitation since the 1870s, with a consistent tone that manages to be both scientifically detached and quietly horrified. Jacob Riis, the journalist and photographer, has already published How the Other Half Lives, with photographs of tenement conditions that caused a portion of the city's comfortable population to put down their newspapers and stare at the ceiling for a while. The reports recommend improved facilities. The landlords hear the recommendations and weigh them against the cost of installation and arrive, repeatedly, at the same conclusion. Some newer tenements, the so-called New Law tenements, built after the Tenement House Act of 1901, are required to have indoor toilets, one per floor, shared among the families on that level. This is an improvement. It is also, if you think about it, still one toilet for multiple families, located in the hallway, but it is inside, it is year-round, and it does not require you to put on your coat at 3 a.m. For children navigating this system, particularly in winter, the chamber pot under the bed becomes a non-negotiable convenience, and emptying it in the morning becomes one of the household tasks that nobody officially volunteers for, and everybody unofficially negotiates around. This is not discussed in the promotional materials for tenement living. The situation is gradually improving. The city is building public bathhouses. Sanitation infrastructure is being upgraded. The death rate from waterborne illness in New York has been falling steadily since the 1890s, which is one of the great quiet public health achievements of the era. But in 1907, in your building, on your morning, none of that statistical progress is especially comforting as you cross the frozen courtyard in the dark, coat pulled tight, moving with a speed and purpose that the cold has made entirely non-optional. You manage, you return, you climb back up the stairs. You consider, briefly, that somewhere in this city there are people with private bathrooms, warm tile floors and hot water that arrives from a tap without any effort at all. You file this information away and get on with your day. You are hungry. Of course you are. You have been awake since before sunrise. You have braved the hallway tap. You have made certain decisions about the outhouse that we will not revisit. And now it is time for breakfast. If you are a working-class immigrant family in 1907 New York, breakfast is not a leisurely meal. It is a logistical operation conducted at high speed over a single shared stove, while children are located, dressed, argued with, and pointed toward the door. Bread is the foundation of everything. Dense rye bread, or a roll from the pushcart baker who passes by before 6 a.m, calling out in whatever language applies to your block, because in 1907 your block has a language. The bread is sliced thick and eaten with whatever is available, which depends on the day of the week and the state of the household budget. Butter, if it is a good week. Herring, pickled, salted, affordable, nutritionally sound, if it is an average week. A scraping of schmaltz, rendered chicken fat, if economy is the priority and flavour is the secondary goal. Tea is universal, made strong and drunk with sugar. Coffee exists but costs more. The children get tea diluted with hot water and sweetened well enough that they accept it without negotiation, which is the main criteria for any food decision involving children at 6 a.m. For Jewish families observing dietary laws, breakfast requires attention to what can and cannot be combined, which adds a layer of organisation to the chaos. For Italian families, the morning might produce something closer to yesterday's bread heated over the stove, perhaps with a little oil, perhaps with whatever is left from the previous night. For Eastern European families, porridge, kasha, buckwheat groats, oatmeal is a common solution to the problem of feeding multiple people cheaply, quickly, and with enough substance to sustain a day of physical labour. The kitchen is the only warm room in the apartment at this hour. Everyone is in it. The stove, the table, the people, the coats hung by the door, the school bags belonging to the children, the lunch being wrapped for whoever is taking lunch to work. All of this is happening in a space that an estate agent in the present day would list as a cosy galley kitchen with original character, and price aggressively. You eat standing up or perched on a corner of the bench because the table seats 4 and there are 6 of you, and the geometry requires some creativity. Breakfast takes approximately 10 minutes. This is not because it is not valued, it is, but because the morning schedule has no flex in it. The factory does not wait. The school bell does not negotiate. The pushcart baker will not be on the corner much past 6:30. There is a window for everything in this life, and the window for breakfast is small and closing. You eat quickly, you drink your tea to the last drop, you wipe the table, and you move. And yet, and this is the part that is easy to miss if you are focused only on the difficulty, breakfast in the tenement kitchen is also one of the few moments of the day when the whole family is in the same room, awake, warm, and not yet scattered by the demands of work and school in the city. Someone tells a joke. Someone complains about the cold. The youngest child says something that makes everyone laugh for a moment genuinely, before the door opens and the day begins in earnest. It is not a long moment, but it is real, and it is theirs, and it happens every morning without fail. Step outside. Go ahead, open that door that sticks at the bottom and doesn't quite latch at the top, and step out onto the street. It is barely 7 in the morning and the Lower East Side is already in full roar. The pushcart market, that magnificent, chaotic, 3-dimensional grocery store with no roof and no price tags, is in full operation. Hundreds of wooden carts line the streets, each one piled high with something. Pickles floating in great barrels of brine, herrings stacked like silver shingles, potatoes, onions, bolts of fabric, buttons, suspenders, live chickens in wooden coops objecting loudly to the entire arrangement. The vendors call out in Yiddish, Italian, Polish, Russian, and a form of English that has been enthusiastically customized by each community. The pushcart is not a charming artisan market. It is a full-contact economic environment. The vendors have been up since 4 in the morning, loading their carts from the wholesale markets on the waterfront, pushing them through dark streets to their established spots, and negotiating with remarkable intensity over who gets which corner. The corners are valuable. The corners have foot traffic. The corners are, in the informal economy of the pushcart market, real estate, and they are contested with a seriousness that would be entirely recognisable to anyone who has ever argued over a parking space. Haggling is not optional. It is the medium through which commerce is conducted. A price called out by a vendor is an opening statement, not a conclusion. You are expected to respond. To not respond, to simply pay the first number offered, is to deprive the vendor of the process and yourself of the result. And frankly, it confuses everyone. The transaction is a conversation, sometimes a brief theatrical performance, occasionally a mild argument that resolves into a sale and leaves both parties satisfied, which is the optimal outcome and is achieved most of the time. You can buy almost anything from a pushcart. Food, obviously, the staples of the tenement diet available in exactly the quantities a household needs for today, because refrigeration is limited and buying more than you can use quickly is waste you cannot afford. But also, eyeglasses, second-hand boots, pocket watches, sheet music, religious items, photographs. There are pushcarts that sell specific things to specific communities, and pushcarts that sell general things to anyone who will stop. There is a man on Hester Street who sells nothing but horseradish, grated fresh each morning, and he has customers who have bought from him specifically for 15 years. The smell of the pushcart market is something that no amount of language fully conveys, though many writers of this era try. It is fish and pickle brine, and horse and coal smoke, and hot bread from a cart near the corner, and the sharp green smell of fresh vegetables just arrived from the market, layered over the general ambient scent of a neighbourhood of very many people living in very close proximity. It is not subtle. It is, in its way, the smell of the neighbourhood being alive. By 8 o'clock you have bought what you need, a loaf of bread, a piece of fish, a bunch of carrots, a newspaper, spent perhaps 30 cents in total, and conducted at least 2 negotiations and 1 conversation that drifted into neighbourhood gossip before returning to the price of potatoes. You know the vendors by face, by name, by the particular rhythm of their pitch. They know you the same way. This street, this noise, this argument as commerce, it is not convenient by modern standards. But it is a community, assembled on a public street every morning, and it runs entirely on the understanding that everyone here is trying to get through the day, and that this is easier done together than alone. You need to get to work. This is where 1907 gets philosophically interesting, because the city of New York in this particular year is in a state of profound mechanical identity crisis. On the same street, at the same moment, you might encounter a horse-drawn wagon, an early automobile coughing and shuddering like a man who has swallowed a lawnmower, an electric streetcar running on rails embedded in the cobblestones, and a bicycle ridden with absolute confidence by someone who has no business being that confident. The Interborough Rapid Transit Subway, the IRT, has been open for only 3 years, and it is already packed beyond anything its designers imagined, because apparently nobody in 1907 anticipated that New Yorkers would enthusiastically use a thing that got them somewhere faster. The elevated railroad, the EL, has been running longer, and if you live beneath it, you have made your peace with the noise in the way that you make peace with something that rattles your windows and interrupts every conversation you have ever had outdoors. The EL runs above 2nd Avenue, 3rd Avenue, 6th, 9th, iron columns bolted to the street, tracks overhead, trains every few minutes, cinders and oil drippings distributed freely to the street and all parties below. It is loud. It is fast. It costs 5 cents, the same as the subway, and that nickel is not nothing when you're watching every cent. But it is the difference between a 40-minute walk and a 10-minute ride. The streetcars run at street level on fixed rails, which means they are subject to the same traffic conditions as the horses and the automobiles, which means they're frequently not moving. The city streets in 1907 are not gridlocked in the modern sense. The sheer volume of vehicles hasn't reached that peak yet, but they are chaotic in a different way, a way that involves horses making independent navigational decisions, automobiles that break down at inconvenient intervals, and pushcart vendors whose carts straddle the streetcar tracks, with an optimism that regularly becomes a problem for everyone involved. If you're walking, the sidewalks are packed. The Lower East Side in 1907 has a population density that exceeds almost anywhere else on Earth. Some blocks house more people per acre than any other place in the world at this moment in history. Walking to work means moving with the crowd, through the crowd, around the pushcart, past the man arguing on the corner, through the intersection where the horse, the automobile, and the streetcar are currently negotiating priority with no clear resolution. The automobile is new enough that it still startles horses, which is a genuine and recurring traffic problem. A horse startled by an automobile can cause a chain reaction of alarmed horses, spilled wagons, and chaos that backs up the entire street for 20 minutes. The automobile drivers respond to these incidents with a combination of frustration and defensiveness. The horse owners respond with a combination of fury and vocabulary. A police officer is frequently involved. It is resolved eventually. It happens again the next day. You arrive at work. You are perhaps slightly late, perhaps slightly damp if it has rained, possibly with someone else's coal dust on your coat from the elevated platform. You have navigated a city that is actively becoming something new, that is building its future transportation system while still running on the one before it, that is loud and crowded and occasionally terrifying and genuinely, stubbornly, exhilaratingly alive. You have done this commute hundreds of times, and you will do it hundreds more. You push open the factory door and step inside, you have arrived at work. For the majority of New Yorkers in 1907, work means a factory, a workshop, or a sweatshop, and the distinction between those last two is largely one of square footage and window count. The garment industry is the beating heart of the Lower East Side economy. Enormous factories and smaller tenement workshops produce the clothing that clothes the nation, and they do it through the labour of hundreds of thousands of immigrants willing to work the kind of hours that would make a modern labour organiser briefly leave their body. You sit at a machine, a sewing machine, a cutting table, a pressing iron, and you work. The workday is 10, 11, sometimes 12 hours long, 6 days a week. The room is long and low and packed with tables and machines and people sitting elbow to elbow, along benches that run the length of the floor. The light is poor, windows exist, but in the tenement workshops they are narrow and face air shafts, and the further you sit from one, the more you are working by gaslight or the first tentative electric bulbs, which flicker with a commitment that is not entirely reassuring. The noise is constant. Sewing machines run on treadles, foot pedals, and the sound of a floor full of them is a mechanical rhythm that fills your ears completely, the way a river fills a valley, until you stop hearing it as sound and start hearing it as silence. The work itself depends on where you're positioned in the production chain. The cutter works at a wide table, layering fabric and cutting through multiple layers at once with long shears. The operator sews at the machine, guiding cloth through at speed, piece after piece after piece. The finisher does the handwork, buttons, hems, the details that the machine cannot manage. The presser stands at an ironing table, with a heavy iron heated on a gas flame, pressing garments flat with strokes that require a full body commitment, because the iron weighs several pounds and must be used with force and speed all day long. By 3 in the afternoon, the presser's arms have done something measurable. By 6, they have done something else entirely. You're paid by the piece, not the hour. This is the structure of the garment trade, and it has a particular psychological effect, which is that every moment you are not working is a moment you are not earning, which means that the bathroom break becomes a financial decision, and the brief pause to stretch your back is something you weigh against the tally of pieces completed. There is no clock watching in the way a salaried employee clock watches. There is instead a constant silent arithmetic, piece by piece, running in the back of your mind alongside whatever you are thinking about while your hands work automatically. The foreman walks the floor. His job is to keep the pace up and the conversation down, and he performs it with varying degrees of human decency depending on the individual, the day, and a range of other factors you cannot fully predict. Some foremen are reasonable men doing a difficult job in a difficult system. Others have understood their authority to mean something broader than it does on paper, and exercise it accordingly. You know which kind yours is. You have known since your second week. In the busy season, fall and spring, when orders come in and must be filled, the hours extend. In the slow season, hours are cut and so is your income, and there is nothing to be done about either. You work when there is work. You wait when there is not. The rhythm of the garment trade is the rhythm of your year, its peaks and valleys shaping everything from what you eat to whether you can pay the rent without borrowing from someone whose expectation of repayment is expressed, politely, weekly. Here is something that will make you set down your imaginary cup of coffee. In 1907, the child walking next to you on the way to the factory is not going somewhere else. In many cases, they are going to the same place you are. Child labour is not yet federally regulated in the United States. That will not happen until 1938. And in the tenements and small workshops of New York, children as young as 6 or 7 contribute to the family income through tasks performed either in the factory itself or, more commonly, brought home. Families take in piecework, finishing garments, rolling cigars, making artificial flowers, and every set of hands in the apartment, regardless of age, is put to use at the kitchen table after supper. The artificial flower industry is one of the most visible examples of tenement homework, and it is also, in a specific way, one of the most poignant. The flowers are made of fabric and wire assembled petal by petal and sold to the fashion industry for use on women's hats, dresses and accessories. The work is fiddly and repetitive and can be done by small hands, which is precisely why it ends up on the kitchen table surrounded by children. Investigative journalists and settlement houseworkers who visit tenement apartments in this era describe finding entire families, grandmother, mother, children as young as 4, seated around a table assembling flowers at 10 o'clock at night, the pile of finished work growing slowly in the lamplight. The city's public schools are genuinely excellent and genuinely free and genuinely trying to get every child in the door. Compulsory education laws exist in New York State. Enforcement is imperfect. A child whose family is in financial crisis is a child whose attendance at school is subject to the pressure of economic necessity, and the school inspector can only be in one place at a time. For families who are managing, barely, carefully, always, the extra income generated by children's work is not a luxury. It is the margin between rent paid and rent not paid. Newspaper boys, newsies, are perhaps the most visible child workers on the New York streets of this era. Boys as young as 8 or 9 buy papers from distribution points before dawn at a wholesale price and sell them on street corners at retail, keeping the difference. The hours are early and the weather is indifferent, and the competition among newsies for good corners is conducted with an intensity that these boys will bring to every endeavour for the rest of their lives, because this is where they learned it. 2 years before your current moment, in 1905, the newsies of New York went on strike against the distribution companies and won, which is one of the more remarkable labour actions in American history, and involved boys who were, at most, 14 years old. Reformers are working on this. The National Child Labour Committee, founded in 1904, is documenting conditions with photographs and reports. Lewis Hine will soon begin his photographic work recording child labourers across American industries with a clarity and compassion that will eventually move legislators. Florence Kelly and Lillian Wald are lobbying for federal protections. The machinery of reform is moving just slowly, the way reform always moves, slightly behind the thing it is trying to fix. The children meanwhile grow up fast. They know what things cost. They know how to calculate. They navigate the city with a fluency that astounds visitors from quieter places, switching languages between blocks, knowing which vendor gives honest weight, understanding the rules of a world that was not designed for them and in which they are nevertheless entirely at home. They are in their way building the future of the city, one afternoon at the kitchen table at a time. At some point around midday there is a break. It is short. It is not what you would call restorative. But for approximately half an hour, sometimes less, depending on who is watching the clock and how seriously they take their authority, the machines go quiet and the workers scatter. For many, lunch is whatever was wrapped in a cloth that morning. Bread, a boiled egg, a piece of herring, a pickle. For those with a few extra coins, lunch is obtained from the street, a hot niche from a cart, a bowl of soup from a basement lunchroom where the proprietor has strong opinions about everything and will share them whether you ask or not. The lunchroom is a social institution. It is where news travels, arguments begin, and labour organisers have quiet conversations in the back corner. The niche, if you have not encountered one, is a baked or fried pocket of dough filled with mashed potato or kasha or sometimes meat, sold from push carts and small shops throughout the Jewish neighbourhoods of the Lower East Side for a few cents. It is warm, it is filling, it is portable. It is, in the context of a half-hour lunch break in a cold New York winter, nearly perfect, and the niche cart vendor positioned near a garment factory at noon is one of the more strategically intelligent small business decisions of the era. You eat standing usually. Sitting is a commitment of time and surface area that the lunch break does not always support. You eat with colleagues, with the people from your floor, your bench, your end of the production chain, and while you eat you talk, and what you talk about is the texture of daily life in a community that is still figuring out how it all works. Who got fired, who got hired, what the foreman said this morning, what is happening in the newspapers, what someone's cousin heard about a new factory opening in the Bronx that pays 50 cents more per piece, which sounds trivial until you do the arithmetic over a week. The labour movement is a presence in these lunch break conversations in 1907, and it is growing. The International Ladies Garment Workers Union was founded in 1900 and is organising with increasing momentum. Triangle Shirtwaist is a name people know. Clara Lemlich, a young garment worker who will in 2 years stand up at a mass meeting and call for a general strike of the entire shirtwaist industry in a speech that electrifies the room, is right now a worker like you, eating lunch from a cloth wrapper, listening and talking and thinking. The general strike, the uprising of the 20,000 it will be called, has not happened yet, but the conversations that will make it happen are happening right now, in lunchrooms and on sidewalks, and at the edges of factory floors. In the half-hour window the workday allows, you finish your lunch, you fold the cloth wrapper and put it in your pocket, you brush the crumbs off your coat. You have perhaps 5 minutes remaining before the machines start again, and you use them standing in the cold air outside the factory door because the factory air, after a morning of breathing it, has earned a brief rest. The street is loud. The pushcart is 2 doors down. A horse goes past, indifferent to everything. You take one more breath of cold, complicated, horse and coal smoke New York air, and you go back inside. The afternoon begins. It is, in length and character, very similar to the morning. Let us discuss your employer. In 1907, the power dynamics of the American workplace are not what you might call balanced. There are no formal grievance procedures. There are no HR departments sending emails about respectful communication. There is a boss, and the boss is, in practical terms, a small sovereign nation operating within your factory walls. In the garment factories, this is often a foreman, a man who has worked his way up from the floor and now takes his authority very seriously, sometimes to an inspiring degree, sometimes to a degree that would have a modern employment lawyer shaking their head slowly and closing their laptop. You do not negotiate. You do not request accommodations, you show up, you perform, and you are grateful that you have the job because outside that door there is a line of people who want it. The boss himself, the factory owner, may or may not appear on the floor. In the larger operations, he operates from an office and communicates through the foreman. In the smaller tenement workshops, he's present constantly, moving through the room with the particular energy of a man who has calculated, very precisely, the cost of every minute of every worker's time and would prefer none of it to be wasted. He knows the production numbers. He knows the order deadlines. He knows, with a specificity that suggests genuine engagement with the arithmetic, what each worker should be producing per hour, and he has opinions about the distance between that number and the actual number. The relationship between immigrant worker and employer in this era is complicated by a shared culture that can be both a source of solidarity and a mechanism of pressure. Many garment factory owners are themselves Jewish immigrants, or the sons of Jewish immigrants, who arrived a generation earlier. They know the neighbourhoods their workers come from, sometimes literally. They may have grown up on the same streets. This shared background creates moments of genuine paternalism. The boss who lends money to a worker in crisis, who attends the worker's child's bar mitzvah. And it also creates a particular dynamic in which exploitation is performed in the language of community, which is a subtle and effective technique. You have rights, technically. New York State has labour laws. There are regulations about hours and conditions that exist on paper and are enforced with the enthusiasm of a city government that has many competing priorities. The factory inspector visits, eventually. The foreman knows approximately when the factory inspector visits, because the factory inspector's schedule is not a state secret, and the conditions observed during an inspection bear a relationship to ordinary conditions that is inspirational rather than documentary. What you actually have, more than formal rights, is the beginning of collective power. The union is organising. The conversations at lunch are not idle talk. They are the slow accumulation of a shared understanding that the individual worker's position is weak and the collective worker's position is not. This understanding is building towards something. You can feel it in the lunchroom. You can hear it in the conversations that pause when the foreman walks past and resume when he doesn't. The machinery of the labour movement is loud and slow and inevitable, and it is warming up right now in 1907 on factory floors exactly like this one. The boss does not know this yet, or perhaps he does, and that is why he is walking the floor with that particular expression today. The factory is not safe. This is not a dramatic overstatement. It is a documented, statistically supported fact of life. In 1907 New York, that going to work involves a meaningful and non-trivial risk of not coming home from work. Machinery is unguarded. Floors are slippery. Fire exits are, in some buildings, locked, a detail that will lead to the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of 1911, one of the deadliest industrial accidents in American history, and a catastrophe that is already being set up by the exact conditions you are living through right now. There are no mandatory safety inspections. There are no enforced protocols. If a machine catches your sleeve, or a fire breaks out, or a floor collapses under the weight of too many workers and too much equipment, what happens next depends almost entirely on luck and proximity to a door. The sewing machine is a relatively forgiving instrument compared to the machinery in other industries, but the cutting room is not. The long shears used to cut through stacked layers of fabric are extremely sharp and operated at speed by workers who have done this thousands of times and whose concentration by the end of an 11-hour shift is not what it was at 8 in the morning. The pressing irons are heated on open gas flames. The fabric scraps accumulate on the floor because sweeping is a secondary concern to production. The gas lamps, where they still exist, burn in rooms full of fabric dust and textile fibre floating in the air like slow snow. Fire is the constant terror. In a room full of fabric, thread, gas flames and cigarette smoking. Because in 1907 nobody has told you that smoking near fabric dust is inadvisable, or they have told you and enforced it inconsistently. Fire moves fast. The buildings are old. The stairwells are narrow. The upper floors have windows, but the windows open onto an air shaft or a 6-story drop, and neither is a useful emergency exit. The fire escapes, where they exist, are iron structures bolted to the exterior of the building with the confidence of a different era and the engineering rigour of a period that did not yet include load testing requirements. Workers are aware of the danger. They talk about it. They know which factories have locked the exit doors during working hours, a practice employers justify as preventing theft and unauthorised breaks, and which workers understand to mean that, in an emergency, The decision about who gets out has already been made for them. This knowledge sits in the background of every workday, not as panic, but as a low, persistent awareness. The way you are always aware of the sound of the EL even when you have stopped consciously hearing it. The city has building inspectors. The state has labour inspectors. There are laws requiring fire escapes, requiring exits, requiring certain minimum conditions. The enforcement of these laws occurs on a schedule that the buildings have largely learned to anticipate. The gap between the regulation and the reality is wide enough that an investigative journalist can walk through it without ducking, and several of them do, filing reports that cause outrage among readers and modest adjustments among building owners, and then gradually a return to baseline. What changes things is not the reports. What changes things is the fire. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of March 1911, 4 years from where you are standing right now, will kill 146 workers, mostly young women, mostly immigrants, in approximately 18 minutes. The city will watch. The city will grieve. And then, finally, the city will act, producing a body of workplace safety legislation that will transform the American labour landscape and be driven almost entirely by the rage and grief of people who had been saying for years that this was coming. You are living in the years before that. Every day you go to work, you are living in the years before that. Your neighbourhood is its own complete civilization, and you may go entire weeks without leaving it. This is not an exaggeration. In the ethnic enclaves of 1907 New York, the Jewish Lower East Side, Little Italy, Chinatown, the Irish neighbourhoods of Hell's Kitchen, the emerging black community of San Juan Hill, life is organised at the block level. Your butcher, your baker, your doctor, your synagogue or church, your cafe, your gossip network, your entire social universe exists within walking distance, and it all operates in your language, follows your customs, and sells the food you recognise. It is simultaneously a comfort and a container, a place that keeps you warm and keeps you in. The Lower East Side in 1907 is the most densely populated neighbourhood in the world. Not in New York, in the world. Roughly 350,000 people live in an area of approximately 1.5 square miles, which means that at any given moment the sidewalks are full, the streets are full, the buildings are full, the air shafts are full of the sound of other people's full buildings, and the concept of personal space is understood theoretically but not experienced in practice. You know this, and you do not experience it as crowding exactly, because crowding implies a standard from which you have deviated, and this is simply the standard. The geography of the neighbourhood is precise and culturally specific in a way that outsiders find confusing and residents navigate instinctively. Hester Street is the centre of the pushcart market. Delancey Street is commerce. Grand Street has the better shops. Essex Street has the market halls where meat and fish and pickles are sold from indoor stalls in a permanent version of the outdoor pushcart. Orchard Street is clothing. Canal Street is the boundary where one world shades into another. Every block has its own character, its own dominant language, its own particular smell from the particular food being cooked in the particular apartments above the particular shops. You know your neighbours the way people know neighbours, when the walls are thin and the courtyards are shared and the stoops are the primary social space. You know who is sick, you know who just arrived from the old country and needs orientation. You know who is doing well and who is not, and both pieces of information circulate through the neighbourhood with a speed that suggests the network is well maintained. The neighbourhood watches itself, feeds itself, argues with itself, and takes care of itself because in 1907 the formal social safety net is thin and the informal one is not. The tension between old country and new world runs through the neighbourhood constantly. The older generation maintains the customs, the language, the calendar of the place they came from. The younger generation is learning English at school, absorbing American rhythms, coming home with information about a wider city that their parents have not yet accessed. This negotiation between what was brought and what is being built happens at every kitchen table, in every language, on every block. It is not always comfortable. It is always interesting. The neighbourhood is the laboratory in which the American immigrant experience is being actively invented right now, one block at a time. It is evening now, and the men of the neighbourhood are drifting toward the one institution that serves simultaneously as bar, social club, political headquarters, employment office, and informal bank, the saloon. In 1907, New York City has approximately 10,000 licensed saloons. 10,000. That is not a typo, and it is not an exaggeration. They are everywhere, on corners, in basements, attached to hotels, and for working-class men who live in cramped tenement apartments, with no parlour, no sitting room, and no space to breathe. The saloon is the only room in the city that belongs to them. A nickel buys you a beer, and with that beer comes the free lunch counter. Bread, cheese, pickled eggs, and whatever else the proprietor has laid out, which might constitute the most substantial meal some men eat all day. The saloon is warm. This is not a small thing in a city where your apartment is heated by a coal stove that requires constant feeding, and the hallway is approximately the same temperature as the street. The saloon has a proper stove or furnace, and it runs it generously because warmth keeps customers in seats, and customers in seats buy beer. The light is better than your apartment too. Gas lamps or early electric bulbs giving the room a yellow warmth that makes everyone look slightly more prosperous than they are, which is one of this saloon's many small mercies. The men who come here are not coming only to drink, though drinking is certainly occurring. They're coming for information. The saloon is the neighbourhood's primary news distribution network. Word of a job opening travels through the saloon. The news from the old country, letters read aloud, newspapers in the native language passed hand to hand, is processed and discussed here. Political opinions are formed here, argued here, sometimes resolved here and sometimes emphatically not. The ward boss, that essential figure of Tammany Hall, often holds informal court in the back of a specific saloon, available to constituents who need something navigated through the machinery of city government, in exchange for the understood currency of political loyalty. The bartender is a figure of considerable social importance. He extends credit to men he trusts, which is a form of community finance that no bank in this era offers to working-class immigrants. He knows everyone's name, everyone's story, everyone's complicated situation. He is the keeper of the neighbourhood's oral history, the person who was present for every significant conversation that happened in his establishment for the last decade, and he has the discretion to store all of it without sharing it inappropriately, which is what makes him trusted and therefore powerful in a specific, local, entirely human way. The temperance movement, the organised campaign against alcohol that will eventually produce prohibition in 1920, views the saloon with a horror that is partly moral and partly class-based, because the temperance movement is largely middle-class and Protestant, and the saloon is largely working-class and immigrant and Catholic or Jewish. The reformers are not wrong that alcohol causes real damage in communities under this much economic stress. They are also not seeing the saloon whole, not seeing it as the library and the town hall and the employment agency and the warm room that it also is, providing services to a population that has no other institution providing them. The saloon is doing the work that nothing else is doing, and when prohibition eventually takes it away, the neighbourhood will feel the absence of all of those functions at once, not just the beer. While the men are at the saloon, let us talk about what the women of 1907 New York are doing, which is everything else. The domestic labour of a tenement household in this era is a full-time, physically demanding, never officially compensated position that begins before the children wake up and ends after they are asleep, and sometimes does not end then either. Coal for the stove must be carried up from the basement, up multiple flights of stairs, in a bucket every single day. Because there is no central heating, water must be hauled. Laundry is done by hand, with a washboard, in a tub, wrung out and hung wherever there is space, which in a tenement apartment means strung across every available surface, turning the apartment briefly into a damp, slightly steamy fabric forest. And this is before we mention that many of the women in this building also work outside the home. The garment factories and tenement workshops run on female labour. The operators at the sewing machines are predominantly women and girls, earning wages that are lower than men's wages for the same work, which is a discrepancy so thoroughly normalised in 1907 that it is written into the structure of the industry rather than acknowledged as a choice. A woman working in a factory comes home and then works in the apartment, which is not referred to as work in any official sense, because it does not appear in any ledger and is compensated with nothing that can be counted. The market is her domain, and she is expert in it. The pushcart negotiation, the management of the household budget, the decision of what can be afforded this week and what must wait. These are her calculations conducted daily, with a precision that a trained accountant would recognise and respect. She knows what herring costs on Monday versus Thursday. She knows which vendor gives honest weight and which has opinions about the scale. She knows how to make a soup from very little that will feed everyone at the table and leave enough for tomorrow, which is a form of culinary engineering that does not receive the recognition it deserves. Women are also, increasingly, the engine of the labour movement. The garment workers organising in 1907 are predominantly women. The settlement house workers, the reformers living and working in the tenement neighbourhoods, are largely women, because the professional options for educated women in this era are narrow, and social work is one of the few fields that welcomes their competence and energy, without requiring them to set it aside at the door. Lillian Wald at the Henry Street Settlement, Florence Kelly at the National Consumers League. These are women doing the work that builds the legal and social architecture of the 20th century, largely without credit in the official history being written around them. The women of the tenement do not call themselves feminists, most of them. They do not use that word for what they are doing, which is surviving with exceptional competence, running households under conditions that would buckle most modern adults, working double days without complaint, because complaint requires energy they cannot spare, and doing all of it while keeping alive the cultural traditions, the recipes, the holidays, the language of wherever they came from, so that the children growing up in this tiny New York apartment still know who they are and where they belong. That is not a small thing. That is in fact the whole thing. If you want to understand 1907 New York at street level, watch the children. They're everywhere. The tenement apartment, crowded with adults and furniture and laundry and cooking smells, has no room for a child to simply exist without being underfoot. So the children are sent outside with an instruction that translates across every language to roughly the same thing. Go. The street becomes the playground, the classroom, and the social laboratory. Children play stickball in the cobblestone alleys, using a broomstick and a rubber ball, and a set of rules that are renegotiated every single game. They swim in the East River in summer, a practice that is both refreshing and medically questionable, given what else is in the East River. The street children of the Lower East Side in this era are a specific and remarkable type of human being. They are multilingual by necessity, English at school, Yiddish, or Italian, or Polish at home, and a fluid street mixture of all of the above with other children, and they navigate the social geography of the neighbourhood with a sophistication that adults who have been in the city longer sometimes lack. They know which blocks belong to which gang of older boys and how to move through them without incident. They know which pushcart vendor will look away from an apple and which one will not. They know the subway system, the elevated lines, the streetcar routes, and they use them to range across the city in groups, with a confidence in their own competence that is either inspiring or alarming depending on how old you are. School is the great organising institution of the Children's Day, and the New York City public school system of this era takes its mission seriously with a capital S. The schools are overcrowded, some running double sessions because there are more children than seats, but they are staffed by teachers who approach the education of immigrant children as a genuine civic project. The curriculum is in English only, which is the policy, immersive and sometimes abrupt. Children who arrive speaking no English leave the school system a few years later reading and writing it, which is simultaneously a triumph of education and a complicated cultural transaction in which something is always exchanged. After school, the street resumes. In the long summer evenings, the stoops are full, not just of children, but of everyone, because the apartments are hot and the street is where the air is, such as it is. The stoop is the front porch of the tenement world, the transition zone between inside and outside, private and public, where neighbours meet and children play at adult feet, and the neighbourhood processes itself in real time. Conversations happen on stoops that would not happen inside, the semi-public nature of the space allowing for a kind of candour that four walls and a closed door do not encourage. The children growing up on these streets in 1907 are growing up to be, among other things, the judges, the congressmen, the labour leaders, the writers, the filmmakers, and the composers of mid-20th century America. Irving Berlin, who will write some of the most American songs ever written, grew up on the Lower East Side. George Gershwin is 11 years old right now, living in Brooklyn. Edward G. Robinson, Al Jolson, the brothers Warner, they're all here or nearby as children of the tenement streets, learning the city from the ground up, picking up everything it has to teach and storing it for later. The street is their school. The city is their curriculum. They are paying attention. Many of the people around you in 1907 New York have arrived recently. Some very recently. Between 1901 and 1910, Approximately 8 million immigrants will pass through Ellis Island, and a significant percentage of them will stay in New York, because by the time they get off the boat, walk through processing, and emerge blinking onto the streets of Lower Manhattan, the idea of going any further seems frankly unreasonable. Arriving in America is not a gentle process in this era. Ellis Island is efficient in the way that a very serious machine is efficient. It processes you, categorizes you, checks your eyes for trachoma with a button hook that it will also use on the person before and after you, and decides within minutes whether you may enter or must return. The crossing itself, in steerage, has taken anywhere from 10 days to 3 weeks depending on the weather and the ship, and it has been an experience that rearranges your relationship with the concepts of space, smell, and optimism. Steerage is the lowest level of the ship, below the waterline, where the cheapest tickets land you in a large communal space packed with hundreds of other people, their luggage, and the cumulative effects of several weeks of ocean travel on human beings with limited access to fresh air and running water. You have arrived in America already tested. Ellis Island is the final examination. The inspectors move quickly. They are processing thousands of people per day, and they have developed a practiced eye for the things that disqualify entry: obvious illness, signs of mental impairment, evidence of prior criminal record, and the inability to demonstrate that you will not immediately become a financial burden on the state. The medical inspection is visual and brief, conducted by doctors moving through lines, chalking letters on the coats of those who need closer examination. A chalk mark on your coat means you are pulled from the line. Most chalk marks resolve into clearance. Some do not, and those stories are the ones that haunt the neighbourhood when they are told. Names are sometimes changed at Ellis Island, which is the subject of significant historical myth. The more accurate story is that name changes happened more often at the point of immigration officials recording names they could not spell or pronounce, or at the individual immigrant's own initiative, choosing an Americanized version of their name to ease their passage into the new country, to sound less foreign, to give their children a name that the school register could accommodate without a long pause. A man named Isidore becomes Irving. A woman named Rivka becomes Rebecca. A surname that required explanation becomes something simpler. These are not losses that happen without feeling, even when they are chosen. Once through, you are on the street. The street is, in many cases, exactly where someone is waiting for you. A cousin, a neighbour from the old village, someone who received the letter saying you were coming and has come to collect you and walk you to the apartment where you will sleep on a folded blanket in the kitchen for the first few weeks while you find your footing. The network of chain migration, one person from a village sending for another, then another, means that the neighbourhoods of New York are organised partially by geography of origin. Streets where everyone is from the same town in Ukraine. Buildings where 4 families are all connected to the same small region of Sicily. You arrive in a foreign country and step into a room that speaks your language, knows your customs, and has already eaten dinner, but saved you a plate. There is one day of the week in your 1907 neighbourhood that is different from all the others, and which day that is depends entirely on which block you live on. For the Jewish population of the Lower East Side, and in some neighbourhoods that is nearly everyone, Saturday is the Sabbath, and the Sabbath is observed with a seriousness that reshapes the entire rhythm of the street. Shops close, the pushcarts disappear, families dress in their best clothes, which may not be significantly better than their regular clothes, but are treated as though they're made of something precious. The synagogue fills. The streets, which on every other day vibrate with commerce and noise, take on a quality that can only be described as comparative quiet, which in New York terms means merely very loud rather than extremely loud. The synagogues of the Lower East Side in 1907 are not grand institutions with permanent buildings in all cases. Many congregations, chevres, small prayer groups organised by men from the same town or region of Eastern Europe, meet in rented rooms above shops, in converted storefronts, in apartments where the furniture has been pushed aside and folding chairs arranged in rows. The building does not determine the seriousness of the observance. Men who have been working 11-hour days, 6 days a week, walk into these rooms on Saturday morning and become, for a few hours, part of something that has been continuous for several thousand years, and the weight of that continuity is a genuine comfort in a life that is otherwise defined by uncertainty and change. For Italian Catholic families, the organising religious day is Sunday, and the rhythm is different. Mass in the morning, the large midday meal that is the social centrepiece of the week, the afternoon that belongs to the family. The Italian Sunday dinner is an institution of such cultural weight that the tenement kitchen, normally a place of efficient production, becomes on Sunday afternoon something closer to a stage set for a performance of family life. The sauce has been cooking since early morning, the table is set properly, everyone is present and everyone has opinions and everyone is talking simultaneously, which is not chaos but a specific and valued form of order. The churches and synagogues of 1907 New York are doing more than religion. They're community centres, social service organisations, meeting halls, and cultural preservation societies. The synagogue maintains the Hebrew school where children learn the language of prayer and the history of the people. The church runs the Mutual Aid Society that provides death benefits to families who have lost a breadwinner. Both institutions hold the cultural memory of the old country and transmit it imperfectly, selectively, with inevitable revision, to children who are becoming American faster than their parents are comfortable with. The tension between religious observance and economic survival is real and constant. The factory does not recognise the Sabbath. A Jewish worker who refuses to work on Saturday loses a sixth of his weekly wage, which is a calculation that religious commitment must be weighed against. Some workers observe fully and accept the financial consequence. Some observe partially, finding accommodations. Some quietly stop observing and quietly feel the loss of it for the rest of their lives. This negotiation between faith and economy is one of the defining experiences of the immigrant generation, conducted privately, at the level of individual conscience, with no clean resolution available, and no one to tell you what the right answer is except the voice that you brought with you from wherever you came from, growing gradually harder to hear over the noise of the city. You're not feeling well. This happens. The tenement is not a sterile environment. You share walls, floors, and air with dozens of other families. The water supply is only recently improved, and the concept of germ theory, while now accepted by the medical establishment, has not yet fully penetrated the daily habits of a city still adjusting to the idea that invisible things can make you die. The doctor in your neighbourhood is a figure of immense authority and variable competence. He may be a recent immigrant himself, trained in a European medical school of varying reputation. He makes house calls, this is standard practice, arriving with a black bag containing instruments that are at least partially cleaned between patients, which is better than it used to be and not quite as good as it should be. The diseases circulating through the tenement population in 1907 are a combination of the ancient and the preventable. Tuberculosis, consumption, as it is still commonly called, moves through overcrowded, poorly ventilated buildings with a patience and thoroughness that is devastating. It is the leading cause of death in New York City, and has been for decades, and it kills slowly and specifically, selecting for people whose lungs spend the most time in the least fresh air, which is to say, tenement residents, factory workers, anyone spending long hours in enclosed spaces with other people. The settlement house workers and health reformers fighting tuberculosis in this era are essentially fighting the tenement itself, because the disease and the living conditions are inseparable. Typhoid fever has been declining since the city dramatically improved its water supply in the 1890s, filtering and eventually chlorinating the water drawn from upstate reservoirs. This improvement has saved thousands of lives and barely gets mentioned because clean water, like all infrastructure that is working correctly, is invisible. The deaths it is preventing are not reported as deaths prevented. They simply do not happen, quietly, and no one writes the headline. Diphtheria and scarlet fever move through the children of the neighbourhood with a seasonality that parents have learned to dread. A child who comes home from school with a sore throat and a fever is a child whose parents are watching very carefully for the next 24 hours, measuring temperature with a thermometer that was expensive and is treated carefully, consulting the doctor if the situation warrants and the budget allows. The doctor's fee for a house call is typically 50 cents to $1, which is an amount that requires consideration. For the many things the doctor cannot fix, and in 1907 there is a great deal in this category, antibiotics being more than 30 years away, the neighbourhood maintains a parallel system of knowledge. The woman on the third floor who came from the same village and knows which tea to make for a fever. The pharmacist who has opinions. The old remedies carried from the old country, some of which work through mechanisms that would be recognisable to modern science, and some of which work through mechanisms that would not be and are doing no harm, probably. Medicine in this era is a negotiation between what the doctor knows, what the family knows, what the budget allows, and what the body ultimately decides to do on its own. 2 out of 4 of those forces are beyond anyone's control, and the remaining 2 are doing their best. You want to understand who actually runs New York City in 1907? Not the mayor. Well, not only the mayor. The answer, if you ask anyone on the street with any frankness, is Tammany Hall, the Democratic Party political machine that has controlled New York City politics since the 1800s, with a combination of genuine community services, strategic generosity, and a relationship with the concept of electoral integrity that is best described as imaginative. The Tammany system works like this. The ward boss, the local representative of the machine in your neighbourhood, is the man you go to when you need something, a job, a reference, someone to speak to the judge on your behalf. Coal in winter, a turkey at Thanksgiving. This is not metaphor. The coal and the turkey are real. Tammany Hall delivers them personally to households that have demonstrated loyalty to the machine through the mechanism of voting correctly and consistently. It is a transactional relationship of extraordinary clarity. You give Tammany your vote, Tammany gives you access to the city, and everyone understands the terms. In a neighbourhood where the formal institutions of government are distant, slow, and conducted in a language you are still learning, the ward boss who speaks your language and can make a phone call that resolves your problem by tomorrow is not corruption in your experience. He is the government made local and human and available. Charles F. Murphy is the boss of Tammany Hall in 1907, a quiet and strategically intelligent man who has modernised the machine from the flamboyant corruption of the Boss Tweed era into something more sustainable and harder to prosecute. Murphy understands that the immigrant population flowing into New York is the future of his organisation, and he has invested accordingly in voter registration, in neighbourhood presence, in the pipeline from block captain to ward boss to alderman to state legislator that keeps the machine's talent supplied and its influence extended. Under Murphy, Tammany will eventually produce politicians of genuine ability, including Al Smith, who will rise from the Lower East Side to become governor of New York and the first Catholic presidential candidate of a major party, and Robert Wagner, whose name will appear on some of the most significant labour legislation of the 20th century. The reformers despise Tammany, and they are not wrong to. The machine extracts money from city contracts with a consistency that is genuinely staggering. The police department, operating within the Tammany system, has a relationship with organised vice, gambling, prostitution, illegal saloons, that is less about enforcement and more about management, specifically the management of who pays and how much. The investigations conducted by reformers in this era document a city government that is simultaneously functional and corrupt, to a degree that would, in a cleaner system, be disqualifying. But the reformers, when they periodically win elections and take over city government, discover something frustrating: the machine's actual service to the community, the coal, the jobs, the bail, the navigation of bureaucracy for people who cannot navigate it alone, does not automatically get replaced by something better just because the corruption is removed. The reformers are better at identifying what is wrong with Tammany than at building the institutions that would make Tammany unnecessary. The machine persists because it is filling a real need in a real community, and until something else fills that need, the community will continue to trade its votes for the services on offer. It is a transaction without romance and without a clean alternative, in a city that is, in 1907, still figuring out what it owes the people who built it. The workday is over, the supper has been eaten, the children are asleep, or have been pointed towards sleep with varying success. And now, if you have a coin or two and enough energy left in your body to be upright, you might go out. Because 1907 New York has invented, or is actively inventing, nearly every form of popular entertainment that you now take for granted. The Nickelodeon is new and extraordinary. For 5 cents, a nickel, you sit in a converted storefront in front of a flickering screen and watch a short, silent film, maybe 5 or 10 minutes long, accompanied by a pianist playing along in real time with enormous commitment and variable accuracy. The films are simple: a train arriving, a comedian falling, a brief drama, but the audience, many of whom have never seen a moving image before, watches with the focused attention of people witnessing a miracle. There are hundreds of Nickelodeons in New York by 1907, and they are packed. They run continuously. You walk in at any point, watch through the program, and leave when you have seen enough or the pianist has lost momentum. The audience is working class, immigrant, mixed, men and women, old and young. And Every nationality, because the film is silent and therefore requires no English and no translation. It is the most democratic entertainment form in the city, available to everyone with a nickel, and it is building in these converted storefronts the audience that will eventually fill movie palaces, and then living rooms, and then the small glowing screens that you carry in your pocket today. For those who prefer their entertainment with more noise and personality, vaudeville is at its absolute peak in 1907. The Vaudeville House, and New York has dozens, ranging from the grand to the extremely informal, presents an evening of variety acts. Comedians, singers, acrobats, animal acts, magicians, impersonators, dramatic sketches, and whatever else the booking agent has assembled into a program. Tickets range from 10 cents in the cheapest galleries to $1 or more for the orchestra seats, and the program runs continuously, so that workers on different shifts can attend at different hours. Vaudeville is the television of its era, the shared cultural reference, the source of catchphrases, the place where performers become famous, and famous performers get tested against a live audience that will tell them immediately and honestly how they are doing. The music halls and cafes of the Lower East Side offer a more specifically immigrant entertainment, Yiddish theatre, which is a thriving industry on 2nd Avenue, and which takes the entire range of human drama and comedy seriously, producing work of genuine ambition for an audience that brings to the theatre the full weight of its own recent history. The Yiddish theatre in this era is doing what all great popular theatre does, taking the experience of a specific community and finding in it the universal, the funny, the heartbreaking, the absurd. It is not a minor cultural footnote, it is the training ground for an approach to performance and storytelling that will flow directly into American entertainment for the next 50 years. Out on the street, simply walking is entertainment. The city at night, with its gas lamps and early electric lights, its saloons spilling sound onto the sidewalk, its pushcart vendors who keep later hours than anyone planned, its density of human activity at every hour. The city at night in 1907 is worth walking through just to feel it. You have worked a very long day, your feet are tired, your back is aware of its own existence in a specific and detailed way. But the city is alive out there, making its noise, and you are part of it, and for the cost of nothing at all, you can walk out the door and stand in the middle of it and feel for a moment that you are exactly where everything is happening. Because you are if New York in 1907 is a pressure cooker, and it is. It absolutely is. Then Coney Island is the valve. On summer Sundays, hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers make their way by trolley, by train, by ferry, and by sheer determination to the beaches and amusement parks of Coney Island, Brooklyn. This is not a gentle seaside stroll. This is a mass migration of the working class toward the one place where, for the price of a few cents, you can forget that you are a garment worker from Minsk who has not had a proper night's sleep in 3 weeks. Steeplechase Park, Luna Park, and Dreamland, the 3 great amusement parks of Coney Island, are competing in a furious arms race of spectacle, each one trying to be more outlandish, more illuminated, more thrillingly impractical than the last. Luna Park is the crown jewel of the 3, and it is, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary places on Earth in 1907. It opened in 1903, and it is lit by more than 250,000 electric light bulbs, a number so extravagant that on the night it first switched on, people standing on the Brooklyn shore reportedly gasped. For a population living in tenements where electricity is a recent and not universal arrival, walking into Luna Park at night is walking into a vision of the future so bright and warm and welcoming that it feels, briefly, like a promise being kept. The towers and minarets and domes of the park's architecture are outlined in light against the dark sky above the beach, visible from miles away. A beacon that the exhausted and the hopeful follow every Sunday all summer long. The rides are mechanical marvels that exist at the precise intersection of engineering ambition and the human desire to be briefly terrified in a safe context. The roller coasters, the shoot-the-chutes, the flip-flap railway generate the kind of fear that is enjoyable specifically, because you know it will end and you chose it voluntarily, which makes it the opposite of most of the fear available in 1907 New York. The fun houses with their distorting mirrors and unexpected air jets and moving floors offer a physical comedy that requires no shared language and no cultural context. You walk in, the floor moves, you grab the person next to you, everyone laughs. It is, in its way, the most democratic art form in the city. The beach itself is free. You do not need to buy a ticket to Steeplechase or Luna Park to spend a Sunday at Coney Island. You can simply go to the beach, take off your shoes, and put your feet in the Atlantic Ocean, which is the same Atlantic Ocean that brought you here and which connects, if you follow it in the right direction, back to wherever you came from. On a hot August Sunday, the beach is packed from the waterline to the boardwalk with bodies, pale and dark, old and young, speaking 20 languages, all doing the same thing, which is lying in the sun and doing absolutely nothing productive, which is the point. The food at Coney Island is its own significant attraction. Nathan Handwerker will open his famous hot dog stand on Stillwell Avenue in 1916, but the tradition of eating cheaply and well at Coney Island is already fully established. Corn on the cob, clams, fried fish, ice cream, cotton candy, saltwater taffy. These are foods that exist in a separate category from the food of daily tenement life, not nutritionally superior, not cheaper necessarily, but eaten outside in salt air without urgency, without the arithmetic of the weekly budget running in the background. They taste like the suspension of ordinary life, which is precisely what Coney Island is selling, and which is precisely why hundreds of thousands of people make the trip every single week all summer long. You ride the trolley home in the late evening, sunburned and sandy and slightly dizzy from the chutes, surrounded by other people in the same condition. The city reassembles around you as you get closer to home, the buildings taller, the streets narrower, the smell more specifically urban. By the time you climb the stairs of the tenement and take off your shoes and lie down on your cot, the apartment feels smaller than it did this morning. But you have been to Coney Island. You have stood in the ocean. You have been briefly terrified on a roller coaster by choice. Tomorrow is Monday, and the factory begins again at 7. But tonight, for a few hours, the city gave you something that cost almost nothing and felt like everything. You want to know what is happening in the world. It is a reasonable desire. In 1907, the answer arrives in your hands every morning in the form of a newspaper, sold by a boy on the corner for 1 or 2 cents, who will shout the headline at a volume calibrated to be heard over traffic, horses, and the general noise of a city that has never once been described as subdued. New York in this year has more than a dozen daily newspapers, each one with a distinctive personality, a specific political allegiance, and a relationship with the distinction between news and entertainment that is, charitably speaking, fluid. The New York World, the New York Times, the New York Journal, the Evening Post, the Sun, the Tribune, the Forward, published in Yiddish for the enormous Jewish community of the Lower East Side, where it will become one of the most influential newspapers in American history. The competition between New York newspapers in this era is total, personal, and conducted without mercy. William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal and Joseph Pulitzer's New York World have spent the previous decade in a circulation war so aggressive, so willing to prioritize drama over accuracy, that it has given the English language the term yellow journalism, named for a popular comic strip character called the Yellow Kid, who appeared in both papers simultaneously after an acrimonious talent dispute, which tells you approximately everything you need to know about the atmosphere. The papers have learned that crime, disaster, scandal, and stories with clear villains sell more copies than policy analysis, which is a discovery they have made with enthusiasm and applied without restraint. The headlines are large and declarative and designed to be read at a distance by someone walking past a newsstand at speed. Mysterious death on Fifth Avenue. Fire claims tenement. Senator accused. The stories beneath the headlines are variable in their relationship to the full facts, but they are vivid, they are readable, and they are written with a directness and energy that is the newspaper equivalent of someone grabbing your arm on the street to tell you something. The prose style of the Yellow Press is not subtle. It is not trying to be. The Forward, the Vorwärts, is a different kind of newspaper entirely, and its influence in the Jewish community of the Lower East Side is difficult to overstate. Founded in 1897 and edited by Abraham Kahan, it is a Yiddish-language daily that takes seriously its responsibility to its readers, who are largely recent immigrants navigating an entirely new country in a language they are still learning. The Forward publishes labour news, fiction, political analysis, and, in a feature called a Bintel Brief, meaning a bundle of letters, a letters column in which readers write in with the problems of their lives and receive thoughtful, humane responses. It is the first advice column of the immigrant experience, and the letters it receives and publishes are a document of extraordinary intimacy. How do I tell my husband I want to work? How do I explain America to my mother? How do I become someone new without losing who I was? You read your newspaper on the subway if you have a seat, standing on the platform if you do not, at the kitchen table if you have a few minutes before the day begins. You read it in pieces, a headline here, a paragraph there, because the full paper is more than the morning allows. The newsboy who sold it to you has already sold 40 more copies and is already moving to the next corner, already shouting the next headline into the general noise of the city, adding his voice to the conversation that 1907 New York is having with itself, loudly, constantly, in every language, all at once. Let us talk about money, which is to say, let us talk about the central anxiety of 1907 New York. If you are a working-class immigrant in the tenements, money is not something you accumulate. Money is something you manage with the precision and tension of someone diffusing a device that is also your rent, your food, your children's shoes, and your passage back home if everything goes wrong. The average wage for an unskilled factory worker in this era is somewhere between $6 and $10 a week, depending on the industry, the season, and the mood of the foreman. A tenement apartment rents for between $8 and $12 a month. A loaf of bread is 3 cents. A pound of beef is 12 cents. The arithmetic is not comfortable. The budget of a working-class tenement family in 1907 has been studied in some detail by reformers and social scientists of the era, and the results are consistent in their conclusion, which is that making the numbers work requires either multiple incomes, extraordinary discipline, or a willingness to go without things that the body technically needs. The rent comes first, always, because eviction is the worst outcome and the landlord does not negotiate on timeline. Food comes second, purchased daily in small quantities because there is limited storage and limited budget, and the pushcart is right there every morning with exactly what you need for today, and no requirement to buy more. Everything else, clothing, medicine, school supplies, the occasional entertainment, is managed from whatever remains after rent and food, which is sometimes a meaningful amount and sometimes an amount that requires creative interpretation. The formal banking system is not available to most tenement residents in any practical sense. The banks that exist in 1907 are not interested in accounts of the size that a garment worker would open, and they are located in parts of the city and operate with procedures that assume a customer with more time, more English, and more existing relationship with financial institutions than most immigrants possess. The result is that financial life in the tenements operates through informal systems. The pushcart vendor extends credit to regular customers. The landlord sometimes accepts rent a week late from tenants he trusts. The mutual aid societies, fraternal organizations organized by ethnic community, collect small weekly dues and pay out in cases of illness, death, or unemployment, functioning as insurance companies run on the honor system. The most important informal financial institution is the family network. Money moves within extended families and community networks with a fluency and obligation that constitutes a parallel economy. The cousin who has been here 3 years and has a steady job lends to the family member who just arrived and has not found work yet. The loan is repaid when it can be, because reputation in the community is a form of credit that matters more than any formal score. People who arrived with nothing and owe their first weeks of American survival to the generosity of people who arrived with nothing before them understand the obligation clearly, and they meet it. The year 1907 is, as it happens, also the year of a significant financial panic, the Panic of 1907, in which the American banking system comes extremely close to a complete collapse, before J.P. Morgan, operating essentially as a one-man central bank from his library on Madison Avenue, organizes a bailout that stabilizes the situation. For the tenement residents of the Lower East Side, the Panic of 1907 arrives as a contraction in available work, a tightening of credit in the informal economy, and a cold season that is harder than usual. The men in the saloon talk about it. The women at the pushcart calculate around it. The children notice that supper is smaller and ask no questions, because they are old enough to understand the answer. Look up. No. Higher. All the way up to the iron structure running above 2nd Avenue, 3rd Avenue, 6th Avenue, 9th Avenue, the elevated railroad, the eel, the shrieking, rattling elevated train line that moves people across the city at speed and delivers, as a bonus, a cascade of metal noise, oil drippings, and cinders directly onto the street and anyone standing on it below. The L has been running in various forms since the 1870s, and by 1907 it is both essential infrastructure and an acknowledged nuisance so extreme that the properties directly beneath it rent for significantly less than those one block away. Stores beneath the L flash their lights in the daytime because the structure blocks the sun. Conversations on the sidewalk below pause automatically every few minutes as a train passes, because talking over it is not a realistic option. The L runs on steam in its older sections and electricity in the newer ones, and the difference is perceptible to anyone standing on a platform. The steam engines announce themselves from several blocks away, with a sound that builds from distant thunder to something more immediate and personal, accompanied by a visible plume of smoke, and, in cold weather, a dramatic cloud of steam that briefly turns the street below into a stage effect. The electric trains are quieter by comparison, a relative term that in the context of the L means merely extremely loud rather than extraordinary, and they have replaced the steam engines on the newer lines as the IRT subway has expanded and modernised. Getting onto the L requires climbing the iron staircase from the street level up to the platform, which is above the roof lines of the shops on either side, and which offers, if you pause to look, a view of the city that most people at street level never see. The rooftops of the Lower East Side, viewed from an L platform, are their own world. Laundry lines strung between chimneys, water towers squatting on their wooden legs, the occasional rooftop garden where someone has planted tomatoes in a barrel, with the optimism of a person who has decided that the city will not entirely defeat them. Children sleep on rooftops in summer, dragging mattresses up the stairs when the apartment heat becomes non-negotiable, lying under the open sky of New York in August, breathing air that is marginally fresher than the air below. The L station itself, the platform, the ticket booth, the wooden waiting room with its bench running along the wall, is a social space of the compressed transactional kind. You buy your ticket, you wait, you do not make eye contact with anyone for longer than is strictly necessary, because this is New York and that is the protocol. The platform fills with a particular cross-section of the neighbourhood that is going somewhere at this hour. Workers heading to factories in other parts of the city, women with shopping baskets, men in better coats heading to offices downtown, children on errands. The train arrives with its noise and its wind and its smell of hot metal. The doors open, the people flow on and off with the efficiency of a system that has been doing this long enough to have developed its own etiquette, and then the train is gone and the platform is quiet for approximately 4 minutes until the next one. The EL is scheduled to be supplemented and eventually replaced by the expanding subway system, which runs underground and therefore deposits its noise into the ground rather than the air, which the street prefers. But in 1907 the EL is still the primary rapid transit for large parts of the city, and its iron skeleton is so woven into the physical and sonic fabric of the neighbourhoods beneath it that when it's finally torn down, decades from now, the residents who remain will describe the sudden quiet as something they did not expect to mourn. The noise, it turns out, was also the sound of the city moving, and the city moving was the sound of being in the middle of something large and alive and going somewhere. It is late. The city has not quieted down. It does not really quiet down. This is New York. The concept is not in the charter, but the quality of the noise has shifted. The pushcart vendors are gone, the factories are dark, the saloon is still lit, but the crowd has thinned to the committed. You climb the stairs of the tenement building, your 4 or 5 flights, past doors where other families are moving through their own versions of the same evening, and you push open your door into the small, warm, coal stove-heated air of your apartment. Someone is still awake. There is bread left on the table. The children are finally, genuinely asleep in a way that suggests they have exhausted themselves completely, which is the only way children in overcrowded apartments sleep. The end of the day in the tenement is a quiet ritual of decompression performed in a very small space. You take off your coat and hang it on the hook. You sit finally, fully in a chair at the kitchen table, and the sitting down is something your body registers with a specific gratitude that is different from any other relief available. Your feet have been inside factory shoes since before 7 this morning. Your back has held a posture required by the work, the machine, the standing at the pressing table or crouching at the cutting bench, and it releases that posture now with a comment that is felt rather than heard. You pour yourself tea from the pot still warm on the stove. You drink it slowly because there is no reason to rush this particular thing. The apartment at this hour is as close to private as the tenement allows. The children are asleep. The neighbours, one thin wall away, are winding down. The street noise is reduced to its late-night register, the distant clatter of a delivery wagon, the voice of someone on a stoop 3 buildings down, the occasional elevated train moving through the dark. You have been surrounded by people and noise since before sunrise, surrounded so thoroughly and continuously that privacy is not something you've experienced as a condition, but rather as a brief interval, a few minutes between one crowd and the next. These minutes at the kitchen table are that interval. There are things you think about at this hour that the day does not leave room for. The letter that needs to be written to the family back home. The letter that will take 3 weeks to arrive and will be read aloud to people who are picturing an America that is not quite the one you are living in, and whom you do not want to disappoint, and whom you also cannot fully explain your actual life to. Because the actual life requires being here to understand. The money that is almost enough and the plan for when it is. The child who said something at breakfast that you have been thinking about since breakfast and have not had a moment to think about properly until now. You blow out the lamp, or switch off the one electric bulb if your building has one. You find your place on the cot or the shared bed with the economy of movement that comes from practicing this in a small space for a long time. The apartment settles. The stove ticks as it cools. The sounds of the building, its creaking, its neighbours, its pipes, its personality, become the white noise of your nights, familiar enough that you no longer register them as sounds, only as the proof that you're not alone, that the building is full of people doing exactly what you're doing, ending the same long day in the same small space, in a city that has asked a great deal of them and will ask the same amount again tomorrow. You close your eyes. Outside, New York continues, it always does. But for now, for these hours, you are still. The city can wait. Let's talk about bathing. Properly. Because if you live in a tenement in 1907 and your building does not have a bathtub, which most do not, then personal hygiene is not a daily private matter. It is a weekly public expedition. The answer to this problem is the public bathhouse, and New York City has built several of them specifically, because city officials have looked at the tenement population, done some arithmetic involving people per bathroom, and concluded that intervention is necessary. The bathhouse is a municipal building, often surprisingly grand on the outside, with tiled walls and individual shower stalls inside, where for a few cents, sometimes for free, you are given a towel, a sliver of soap, and approximately 20 minutes of hot water that you will treat as though it is the most precious substance on earth, because in your current life, it essentially is. The People's Baths on Centre Market Place, the bathhouse on Rivington Street, the facilities on Mott and on Allen, these are institutions that the neighbourhood uses with the regularity and seriousness that a different class of person reserves for a private bathroom at home. You go on Saturday, typically before the Sabbath, because there is a cultural logic to arriving at the day of rest clean, and because Saturday is the day when the week's accumulation of factory air and coal smoke and general New York atmosphere has reached a level that even the most stoic tenement resident acknowledges requires addressing. You bring your own soap if you have it, because the soap provided by the facility is a utilitarian object with no fragrance and no ambitions beyond its basic function. You bring a clean change of clothes folded under your arm, because the point of the exercise is not merely to be clean, but to put on clean clothes and walk out into the Saturday street feeling like a person who has their situation under control. This feeling is temporary and valuable and worth the trip. The bathhouse attendant gives you a ticket. The ticket corresponds to a stall. The stall is a tiled cubicle approximately 4 feet wide with a shower head and a drain and a hook for your clothes and nothing else. You have 20 minutes, enforced by a timer that the attendant monitors, with the focus of someone who has 40 people waiting and no interest in renegotiating anyone's allocation. 20 minutes sounds brief, until you consider that the alternative is no hot water at all, at which point 20 minutes of unrestricted hot water becomes a near-spiritual experience. The ritual of the bathhouse is also, unavoidably, a social one. You wait in line with your neighbours. You recognise people from your floor, your block, your factory. The waiting area has the quality of a room where people are pretending to mind their own business, while actually conducting low-level community surveillance. Who looks well, who looks tired, whose children have grown, who has a new coat. The conversations that happen while waiting for a shower stall are briefer than saloon conversations, and more informative than newspaper headlines, and they cover the same range of topics that all neighbourhood conversations cover, which is to say everything. For the children, the bathhouse is an adventure of a specifically municipal kind. The tiled walls, the sound of water, the echoing acoustics that make every noise larger and more interesting than it is outside. Children in the bathhouse shout because the shout comes back at them from the tiles, which is a physical phenomenon they are not tired of regardless of how many times it has happened. The attendant is tired of it. The attendant has been tired of it since his first week. You emerge from the bathhouse into the Saturday afternoon with damp hair and clean clothes, and a sensation that is the physical equivalent of pressing reset. Not on the circumstances, which remain exactly what they were, but on your relationship to them. The tenement is still the tenement. The factory begins again Monday. The budget is what the budget is, but you are clean, and the air is cold and clear, and for a few hours before the week reassembles itself around you, you walk through your neighbourhood feeling like the version of yourself that is on top of things. It is, given everything, not a small achievement. There is a shop on nearly every block in the working-class neighbourhoods of 1907 New York, identified by 3 brass balls hanging above the door, and if you know what those balls mean, you either have been here before, or you are about to be. The pawn shop is the financial institution of the tenement economy. There are no savings accounts for most working-class immigrants. There are no personal loans from reputable banks who have any interest in lending to a garment presser from Galicia with no collateral, and a surname that the bank officer cannot pronounce. What there is a man behind a counter who will give you cash money today in exchange for something you own, with the option to buy it back later for slightly more money, and no judgment offered, because he has seen everything and nothing surprises him anymore. The 3 brass balls above the door are a symbol with a history stretching back to the Medici banking family of Renaissance Florence, which is not something the tenement resident necessarily knows or needs to know, but which means that the pawn shop is, in a very real sense, one of the oldest financial institutions in Western civilization, providing a service so consistently necessary that it has survived every economic era intact. This is either comforting or alarming, depending on how you look at it. The transaction is straightforward. You bring something of value, a watch, a piece of jewellery, a musical instrument, a good coat, a sewing machine, tools, and the pawnbroker examines it, assesses its resale value, and offers you a loan of approximately a third to half of what he believes he could get for it, if you do not return. You negotiate briefly, because not negotiating is a form of leaving money on the table that the tenement economy cannot afford. You reach an agreement, you receive cash, you receive a ticket. The ticket is your record and your promise. Bring it back within the agreed period with the loan amount plus interest, and your item is returned. Fail to return, and the item goes into the window to be sold. The pawnshop window is one of the more melancholy display cases in the tenement neighbourhood. A collection of objects that represent the emergencies and miscalculations of the community, arranged on velvet with a price tag. The watch that belonged to someone's father, the candlesticks that came over on the boat from Warsaw, the good dress set of tools that a carpenter put up during the slow season and could not redeem. These objects sit in the window and wait to be claimed or purchased, and many of them are eventually bought by people in roughly the same circumstances as the people who sold them, which gives the pawn shop a certain recycling quality, a circulation of objects through the same stratum of the economy, passing from one careful hand to another. In the weeks before the winter holidays, the pawn shop becomes particularly busy. The desire to mark the occasion, to give the children something, to put a better meal on the table, to honour the holiday in some visible way, runs directly into the budget constraints of late November and December, and the pawnbroker is the point where these two forces meet and negotiate. He has seen this pattern every year for 20 years. He adjusts his hours accordingly. The pawnbroker himself is often a fixture of the community, in the way that all essential service providers become fixtures, known, sometimes respected, sometimes resented for the interest rates, always needed. He remembers who has redeemed their items reliably, and who has not. He is, in his way, a custodian of the neighbourhood's private history, holding its objects and its secrets with the discretion of someone whose business depends on being trusted by people who have very few other options. He is not a villain, he is not a hero, he is the pawn shop, and the pawn shop is open, and the light above the 3 brass balls is on. Not everyone in 1907 New York is trying to extract something from the tenement population. Some people have arrived with the opposite intention entirely, which is to say they have come to help, and they are doing it with a focused, organised, slightly overwhelming energy that the neighbourhood did not ask for and has come to depend on anyway. The settlement house is an institution, Hull House in Chicago being the most famous nationally, but Greenwich House, Henry Street Settlement, and others serving the same function in New York, where educated, often wealthy reformers actually move into the tenement neighbourhoods and live there, on the theory that you cannot help a community you do not understand, and you cannot understand it from a comfortable distance. Jane Addams has already proven the model. In New York, Lillian Wald is running the Henry Street Settlement on the Lower East Side, providing nursing care, education and advocacy for the immigrant poor with a competence and determination that is quietly rewriting what government owes its citizens. Lillian Wald arrived on Henry Street in 1895 and she has not left. She is 39 years old in 1907, and she has spent the last 12 years doing the work that the city's formal institutions were not doing, sending nurses into the tenements to treat the sick in their homes, because the sick in their homes cannot always get to the hospital, and because treating a disease in the tenement where it is spreading is more effective than treating only the individual who has already come down with it. The Henry Street nurses are a presence in the neighbourhood that is trusted in a way that official medical institutions are not, because they come to you, they learn your language if they can, and they do not charge more than you can pay. The settlement house offers classes, English classes for the adults who need it and want it, and are trying to learn it at the end of a long working day, which is an act of determination that deserves more recognition than it receives. Citizenship classes for those working toward naturalization. Cooking classes that are less condescending than they sound. They're teaching the nutritional principles behind the food choices that stretch a budget while maintaining health, which is genuinely useful information delivered by people who have bothered to understand what the neighbourhood is actually eating, and why. Sewing classes, music classes, a kindergarten for children too young for public school, a library, a place to sit in a clean warm room and read, which is a luxury so specific and so quietly transformative that its value is difficult to quantify. The settlement house workers are predominantly women, and they are using the settlement house as the professional platform that other fields are not providing them. A woman with a degree from Vassar or Wellesley in 1907 has a narrow range of respectable professional options, and social work, done with full seriousness, with data collection and policy advocacy and genuine community engagement, is one of them. Florence Kelly uses her base in the settlement house movement to lobby for child labour laws and minimum wage legislation. Lillian Wald uses hers to push for public health nursing as a government function, for what will eventually become the Children's Bureau in the federal government, for policies that begin with the specific suffering of specific people and work outward towards systemic change. The neighbourhood has a complicated relationship with the settlement house, as communities generally do with institutions that have decided to help them. There is genuine gratitude for the nurses, for the kindergarten, for the English classes. There is occasional resistance to the cultural assumptions embedded in some of the programming, the implication, not always subtle, that immigrant culture requires improvement before it meets the American standard. The settlement house workers are, at their best, aware of this tension and working against it. At their less than best, they are carrying assumptions they have not yet examined. The neighbourhood, for its part, takes what is useful, declines what is not, and continues to manage its own affairs with the competence it has always demonstrated, now with the added resource of a nurse's station on Henry Street that is open when you need it. Before we get too romantic about the automobile age just beginning to arrive in 1907, let us take a moment to fully appreciate and fully reckon with the animal that actually runs this city. The horse. In 1907, New York City has approximately 120,000 horses working within its limits on any given day. 120,000. They pull delivery wagons, fire engines, milk carts, coal wagons, ice wagons, brewery wagons, garbage wagons, and the vehicles of the wealthy who have not yet committed to the automobile. The city could not function without them, and the city also cannot quite function with them, because 120,000 horses produce approximately 100,000 pounds of manure per day, deposited directly onto the streets, where it dries, pulverizes, and becomes a fine particulate that rises into the air and settles on everything, including you, including your lunch. The horse manure problem of late 19th and early 20th century New York is one of the great underreported urban crises in American history, and it is underreported largely because it has been solved by the automobile of all things, before most people living after 1920 have reason to know it existed. But in the 1890s, urban planners were writing seriously alarmed reports, projecting that if the growth of horse-drawn traffic continued at its current rate, The manure on the streets of New York would be 9 feet deep by 1930. 9 feet. This was not a metaphor. This was arithmetic. The problem was called the Great Horse Manure Crisis of 1894 by the people writing the alarmed reports, and it is genuinely one of the reasons that the automobile, when it arrived, was greeted as a civic improvement rather than an intrusion. In 1907, the crisis has not yet been solved. The streets are still substantially horse-operated, and the street cleaning department, which employs several hundred men with shovels and carts to address the daily output of the city's horse population, is fighting a battle of scale that never quite resolves in their favour. The street cleaners work in shifts. They have a commissioner, George Waring, who dressed them in white uniforms and organised them with military discipline, and is regarded as a genuine civic hero for the improvement he has brought to a situation that was, before his tenure, significantly worse. The streets are cleaner than they were in 1880. They are not clean. The horses themselves are not living well. The working horses of New York streets are often overworked, underfed, and housed in stables that the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, founded in 1866, which tells you something about how long this problem has been acknowledged, visits with regularity and cites with frequency. A horse that collapses in the street, which happens with enough regularity to have generated a standard municipal protocol, creates an immediate traffic problem that is resolved by a crew of men with specific equipment and a practiced efficiency that is both impressive and a little grim. The dead horse removal service of New York City in this era handles roughly 15,000 horses per year. This number is in the official records. It is not a comfortable number, and yet the horse is also beautiful in the way that working animals are beautiful. The draft horses pulling the brewery wagons, enormous and patient, their breath steaming in the cold morning air, their hooves striking the cobblestones with a sound that is one of the defining sounds of the city in this era. The milk wagon horse that knows the route better than the driver and stops at the right buildings without being told. The fire horses sleek, trained to an extraordinary level of responsiveness, capable of going from standing in a stall to harness to a pumper engine and moving through the street in under a minute, which is a performance that draws crowds even in a city that has seen most things. The horse is leaving, the automobile is arriving. But in 1907 the transition is not complete, and the city still runs, substantially and essentially on hay and oats, and the patient labour of animals that have no idea they are about to become obsolete. And yet, with all of it, the tenement, the cold water, the outhouse, the 12-hour shifts, the manure-dusted air, the pawn shop, the foreman, the noise, the smell, the relentless grinding difficulty of every single day, they stayed. This is the part that deserves to be said clearly and held for a moment before we let it go. The people who built their lives in 1907 New York did not stay, because they had no other options, or not only because of that. They stayed because the city made a kind of promise, imperfect, frequently broken but present, that your children could be something you were not, that the daughter of a presser could go to school, that the son of a peddler could become a doctor, a lawyer, a person who wore a suit to work and came home at a reasonable hour. New York in 1907 is loud and filthy and exhausting and dangerous. It is also, undeniably miraculously, almost unreasonably full of people who believe that things can get better. The belief is not naive. These are not people who arrived without understanding hardship. They came from places where the options were, in many cases, worse, from the pogroms of Eastern Europe, from the poverty of southern Italy, from the famines and political violence that made leaving a rational decision rather than a sentimental one. They have done the comparison. New York, with all its difficulty, is on the better side of it. This is not comfort exactly, but it is a foundation, and foundations are what you build on. The public school is the most visible architecture of the promise. The school building, solid, often imposing, built by the city with a seriousness that communicates that this institution matters, stands in the tenement neighbourhood as a daily reminder that the city has made a commitment to the children inside it. The teachers, many of them the children of immigrants themselves, one generation earlier, teach with an intensity that is partly professional and partly personal, because they know exactly what is available on the other side of education, and they have chosen to deliver it. The children who walk out of those schools speaking English, doing arithmetic, knowing the history of a country that is still deciding whether it wants them, those children are the evidence that the promise is being partially kept. The labour movement is another form of the promise, being built right now on the factory floors and in the lunchroom conversations and at the union meetings held in the back rooms of saloons. The promise being constructed there is slower and harder won, and requires people to risk their jobs and sometimes their safety to pursue it. But it is a promise of a different kind, that work should have dignity, that hours should have limits, that the person at the machine has rights that the person who owns the machine is obligated to respect. This promise will take decades to fully deliver. The people making it in 1907 do not always live to see it. They make it anyway. What the people of 1907 New York are building, without calling it that, is the middle class of the 20th century. The garment worker's daughter becomes a teacher. The peddler's son becomes an attorney. The presser's grandson becomes a congressman. The chain is long and the links are made of school fees and union cards and pawnshop tickets and Saturday afternoons at Coney Island, and letters written home by lamplight and small savings accumulated against large uncertainty. It is not a straight line. Nothing about this story is a straight line, but it is a direction, and the direction is forward, and the people walking it know it, even on the days when the evidence is hard to see. The city asked everything of them. They gave it. And what came back, not immediately, not easily, not without enormous cost, was a New York that is, in its culture and its character, and its stubborn refusal to be one thing, the direct product of the people who lived in those tenements and rode those elevated trains and argued over the price of a herring on a cold Tuesday morning in 1907. That city belongs to them. All of it. Every last improbable, magnificent, exhausting inch of it. Here is the outro, and so, here we are. At the end of a very long day in 1907 New York, you have hauled coal up 5 flights of stairs, you have negotiated over herring in 3 languages, you have sat at a machine for 11 hours in a room that was too hot and too loud and not quite safe enough, and you have done it without complaint because complaint was a luxury the week's budget did not include. You have ridden the elevated train through the noise and the cinders and arrived somewhere every time. You have fed your children, written your letters, climbed your stairs, and ended the day in a room the size of a generous closet that you have made, against all reasonable odds, into something that feels like home. The people of 1907 New York were not extraordinary in the way that history books usually mean when they use that word. They were not generals or presidents or inventors with their names on buildings. They were pressers and peddlers and pushcart vendors and mothers doing the math at the kitchen table at midnight. They were people for whom every single day was a negotiation between what was needed and what was available, conducted without a safety net and without the option of stopping. And they were funny about it, and stubborn about it, and occasionally magnificent about it in ways that nobody was recording at the time, because the people worth recording, in 1907, were assumed to live somewhere else entirely. They did not live somewhere else. They lived on Hester Street, and Orchard Street, and Mulberry Street, and 100 other streets that smelled of fish, and coal smoke, and someone's mother's cooking drifting down from a 3rd-floor window. They built something there. Something that is still standing, still running, still arguing, still somehow working, in the form of a city that contains the memory of every person who ever bet everything on it and refused to leave. So tonight, as you sink into your clean bed with your hot water and your indoor plumbing and your very own bathroom that you do not share with 47 people, maybe take one quiet moment to acknowledge the people who carried coal up 5 flights in the dark so that their children would not have to, who stood at a machine for 11 hours so that their grandchildren could stand somewhere else, who arrived with nothing and built out of nothing the most improbable city on earth. They were cold a lot of the time. They were tired almost all of the time. They were, without question, doing something that mattered. Rest well tonight. You have earned it. And so did they.